Good afternoon. I'm Randy Horton on behalf of myself and Bernhard Capital Orthogonal and Michelle Jump and Buddy Smith from MedSec. Want to welcome you here to the webinar. It's great to see so many people out here. Know you have busy schedules and have a lot of things to allocate your time to, so we appreciate you putting your time on this today. We're going to try and make the most of every minute here for you and pack. When you leave, hopefully you'll feel like we've packed more than 4 hours of good content into 60 to 90 minutes. People today have a ton of expertise working at the intersection of Bluetooth, cybersecurity, and medical devices, and I think have a lot to download and are really looking forward to answering the questions you've submitted already and answering the ones coming up. We've now been doing webinars for well over a year like this monthly, really trying to get deep into content, and have gotten a lot of great questions and a lot of good interactions. Thrilled that Orthogonal and MedSec have teamed up this year to do this series around using Bluetooth with medical devices, around cybersecurity and other issues. Whole slew of content we've been producing, these webinars, blogs, interviews, collections of other resources. We just recently posted a list of every recall we could find that was linked to Bluetooth and those kinds of things. So we're looking for more ideas and input from you all as we continue this forward. Please send in your things. This webinar will be posted very shortly thereafter on YouTube. And we'll also be writing a blog that sort of summarizes the webinar coming up sometime next week, although I'll give the caveat, I guess this is the second month in a row I'm saying this, next week's a holiday week, so it may take an extra day or two. Actually, Curly, if you could please post in the chat for everybody the URL where people can find this series with all kinds of content. You'll also find there registration links for the next 2 webinars we'll be doing. One is related to edge cases, sort of all the exception scenarios that make Bluetooth so interesting and challenging with medical device. And the other one is going to be around testing and integrating Bluetooth from a smartphone side with the medical device side, and what are some of the technical considerations for that. Our goal today, hopefully all of you will leave it with at least a few gold nuggets, some insights you can use right away, and get you thinking about how you can use this to apply to your things. And of course, we're not here to sell you, but we are always available if you want to talk much deeper about cybersecurity with the MedTech folks, with us about doing Bluetooth development for connected devices. We do want to hear your questions, so please keep them coming through the chat, and we will try and facilitate and address them all. If it's far too technical or narrow, we may be able to answer you offline, or somebody may be able to see the chat and post to address it. Generally, the way we do this is 50 minutes, so by 50 minutes in, we will have covered all the content we've promised for you and answered some questions. But we will stay on a full 90 minutes and field questions as long as there's more questions to take. And generally what we found is that every time we go to 85, 90 minutes, and usually about 40% of the people are still with us an hour and a half in submitting questions. So as long as you're in for it, we're in for it and are happy to stay on. But for those of you who do have to get in for lunchtime and get out, if you're in the eastern part of the United States, we'll try and keep that compact for you. So I'll let each of our speakers introduce themselves. They've got, like I said, a wealth of knowledge at this intersection around Bluetooth, medical device, and cybersecurity. And they'll all tell you that, even if I may call them an expert, they never stop learning. This is an endless treadmill in a good and interesting way. And I think they're kind of very excited to share a point in time. So I'll ask them, each of them, as I introduce them, to say a little bit about themselves. Why are they here? Like what got you qualified to be on this panel today? And also from the CEOs, I'd ask them to just give a couple sentences about their firm and how their firm fits in and what they do with that. So let's start with Michelle Jump, CEO at MedSec.
Thanks, Randy. So this is Michelle Jump, CEO from MedSec. I'm joining you today probably more for my background around security risk management and regulatory compliance. Bluetooth is always a really hot topic with regulators from a risk management standpoint, a design standpoint. So really, Buddy is the technical expert and Bernhard, technical experts on this call. I will weigh in from, so what do the regulators think about this? What do we think about this from a standards perspective? I've been doing this for about 14 years. Love it. From the MedSec point of view, I've been with MedSec since 2018, helping to stand up the kind of consulting and services arm. Here at MedSec, we have kind of a unique collaboration of skill sets where we provide quality and regulatory compliance support for submissions around medical device security, do a lot of work in that space around risk management, submission support. And then the other side of the business is on the technical arm, which is where Buddy sits, where we have a phenomenal group of pen testers and technical folks who help with the technical side of security. So we do a balanced compliance and technical support for medical device security, and that is the only lane we swim in. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you. Bernhard Kappa, please.
Yeah, hi. Bernhard Kappa, founder and CEO of Orthogonal. As you guys probably know, we design and build medical device software, a lot of Bluetooth connected medical devices, focusing heavily on that Bluetooth connectivity, mobile apps, and cloud. And obviously, cybersecurity is a huge part of that we kind of integrate into our agile processes and is an, ongoing, ever-changing area as both the threats get more sophisticated and the tools you can use get more sophisticated, and as the ecosystems overall become more sophisticated as well. So as Randy mentioned, it's a constant learning process, and it's great to have partners like MedSec that specialize in cybersecurity.
Excellent. And Buddy Smith, who's unfortunately, he was doing these great like pirate overlays on his face before. I was hoping we would stick with one for this, or the Zorro one. But Buddy, could you introduce yourself and tell us why you're
My name's Buddy. I've been with MedSec for about a year now. I began my career as an embedded systems developer and firmware engineer, doing a lot of work with very reliable software update mechanisms that included security and encryption. So I applied that knowledge when I moved over to the security space. I like to say I know enough about cryptography to be dangerous. If I knew more about cryptography, I'd probably be heavily recruited by the NSA. But I really like using this knowledge to help our clients build and secure their devices, and also make sure that the encryption schemes they're using are going to pass regulatory muster. We've had a lot of work recently supporting our clients as they discuss things with the FDA, especially around data security and code signing and all of these sorts of issues. So at MedSec, I'm the director of technical consulting services. So I work with our clients to figure out what services they need in terms of penetration testing or threat modeling, and then work with our team to make sure we get the right consultants assigned to the right engagement. So.
Excellent. Great. Well, thrilled to have all of you. Michelle, I'll target the first question at you, and this picks up from a couple of questions that people submitted in advance that I would summarize as, hey, what the heck's going on? As we hit midpoint for 2023, when you talk to the FDA, what's going on with cybersecurity in general? What are they looking for? What's the new guidance they've put out? How do we synthesize that? And really, like, how does that tie into Bluetooth? Just sort of a high level gestalt for us, if you would.
Sure. So high level, I'd say most folks who are joining this call have probably heard something around the area of the Omnibus Act and the fact that FDA now has statutory authority to demand a lot more content around security than they did previous to that. That went into effect on March 29th. But what that means is, in order to get through an FDA submission, there's now legal expectations for providing a lot of information. A lot of this is around the post-market space, but still the bar is ever rising, not just for the FDA, but the EU is telling us kind of informally that they're going to be expecting the same thing that the FDA expects. So this expectation that devices are designed to be securely robust enough to handle the environment into which they're put is first and foremost. And it becomes the expectation of the medical device manufacturer to demonstrate that in their documentation. This is where Bluetooth comes in. The strong focus around security risk management and threat modeling activities that we're seeing from all regulators wanting to see more robust risk management comes into where can threats enter a system, and Bluetooth and these communication spots are a big one. And the FDA is definitely very interested to understand how you've designed and secured your Bluetooth capabilities, because we know that those are common entry points of an attack scenario. So when we're thinking about our design, we can't just say, oh, well, I'll just put in Bluetooth and that will be how we communicate. You really have to proactively think defensively on how you're going to configure that Bluetooth communication to ensure that it is secure, not only when you design it, but also that you maintain, if there are any vulnerabilities that pop up, that you're patching those. Those are really big focus areas, ongoing maintenance. And the FDA, if you are communicating with Bluetooth, they will be looking at how you've designed it, configured it, and how you're going to manage it. So just a very easy place for them to look.
Great context. Thank you. If people have follow-up questions on that, please submit them. So for the second question, let me flip it over to Buddy. So Buddy, why are we talking, I guess, interestingly, we titled this, it wasn't a Bluetooth, wasn't the title, it was Bluetooth Low Energy, BLE. Why is this webinar about BLE as opposed to Bluetooth in general?
When I think about Bluetooth, most people think about their phone or music players or headphones and streaming audio. And Bluetooth, the full Bluetooth stack is really designed for, one device to communicate to one other device. It's very power hungry. It's got really good throughput in terms of you can send large amounts of data over it. But when we're looking at the medical device space, we have things that might be implanted that have a very, very limited battery life and a very limited power budget, but they also don't need to transmit these enormous amounts of data. The primary technical differences are the way that the frequency hopping works. But generally speaking, we're seeing a lot more medical devices with low energy Bluetooth just because it fills a need to be able to securely communicate small amounts of data without blowing your power budget.
And presumably there are cybersecurity considerations that are more prevalent with BLE than Bluetooth in general?
I kind of look at it as any communication interface you have, whether it's a proprietary medical device spectrum like the mobile implant communication service, or full Bluetooth or Bluetooth low energy or Wi-Fi, you really have to look at any communication interface and think about the security of that interface. It's almost at a design level, it's agnostic as to what the transport is, but you still want to secure that transport.
Excellent. And could you maybe
I would
just
add, sorry, I would add one thing to the kind of the why BLE. Very often what you're doing is also BLE connectivity to a smartphone, and the same kind of power consumption issues are also something to think about. Lots going on the smartphone, and Bluetooth Classic uses a lot of power as well, and so it's important on both sides of that as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, honestly, I've been a little surprised to see Bluetooth low energy in so many devices that I wouldn't have expected. We've been seeing implantable cardiac pacemakers that are using BLE now instead of proprietary radios, and it's really surprising, but it makes sense when you think about you're leveraging this massive ecosystem of Bluetooth low energy chipsets that have been really well developed instead of something that you're having to go out and engineer yourself. So you're leveraging sort of this economy of scale. So it surprised me at first, but I've come around to understand why it's happening, and I think it's brilliant. Especially with, like you said, the smartphone. My smartphone can't communicate with a device in the medical implant spectrum because it doesn't have a radio for it, but my smartphone can do Bluetooth low energy. So it enables a lot of connectivity and interoperability that was really hard previously.
So it's democratized things is the upshot. The downside is that Bluetooth cybersecurity is a well-known issue outside of MedTech, and it's opened up the world for more. You better be on top of it because it's better understood on all sides. So we actually, it's funny, we got a couple questions in, which I think dovetail very well with the next question. My question was going to be, what are the major domains of cybersecurity and BLE that people need to be concerned with? Kind of what are the big buckets of challenges? Somebody asked here, I provide engineering regulatory quality support for medical device companies. What would be the top 3 to 5 questions I should ask to determine if we're aligned or non-compliant with the FDA? So kind of, how do you bucket this world? Like if you need to make your major categories.
Well, I guess I would ask a clarifying question about whether that means from a BLE perspective or of a, are you getting this overall?
Let's do BLE for this one.
Yeah, because like those are very different answers, right? So the first 3 to 5 questions I would ask is, have you captured Bluetooth in your threat model? Have you captured Bluetooth in your risk management? And what are your requirements around Bluetooth to ensure that you've ensured the most secure configuration that you can? And the answers to those questions will be very interesting because they either know what you're talking about or they haven't thought about that yet, and you want to encourage them to do that. So Buddy may have some additional items. One of the things that's kind of unique about MedSec is we have tech folks and compliance folks, but we also do a lot of work together. So our tech folks speak regulatory and our regulatory people speak tech. So Buddy probably has some thoughts around this from an FDA perspective, I would think as well.
I'd say the 2 hot button issues that Eve noted. The first one is going to be, do you have a plan to do over-the-air firmware updates? Because the FDA is very insistent on patchability. If you don't have that plan, you're definitely going to want to start working on it. And with that over-the-air update process, you want to make sure that it is secure so that the firmware is signed and verified. We're strongly encouraging all of our customers to implement public key infrastructure for signing of things, not just like code, but other things, providing device identity. The other thing that I think Michelle actually clued me in on was the FDA is very, very insistent about your plan for if your cloud service goes down. So if you have a device that relies on a cloud system to do its communication, to perform its function, they're going to ask you, what is your plan for this system going down? How can you continue to provide your functionality? Those are the top 2 that I can think of off the top of my head. Michelle, do you want to expound on those?
Well, would they be looking at particular configurations on the Bluetooth side of things, like best practices from a security perspective that would be defensible for a submission when they get into the technical questions? Because one thing that I have noticed a significant increase right now is the FDA weighing in on your design. This is not something that we would have seen last year even. They have very strong opinions on your protocols for encryption, AES 128 versus 256. They have very strong feelings about a lot of design considerations that we've not really seen before, because the FDA has typically considered that the domain of the medical device manufacturer to decide. So I guess my follow-up question there, Buddy, would be around the Bluetooth perspective. What would the FDA be looking for that would demonstrate they know what they're talking about in securing that particular aspect of functionality?
So I think one thing that's kind of telling is, what pairing mode are you using? If you're using just works pairing with limited security, they're going to ask you why, and they're going to expect you to be able to justify the answer. It's not that they're going to say you can or can't do something, but they want to know, what decisions did you make and how did you justify them based on the risk or based on other controls. Another recommendation that is aligned with NIST guidance on Bluetooth security is, if you have a communication link over Bluetooth Low Energy between your cloud and a smartphone and the device, not just relying on the Bluetooth security, but also implementing an additional encryption on top of that, so called application layer encryption, where, if my mobile device is really passing a message from my cloud to my BLE device, then maybe my mobile device doesn't even need to be able to know the content of that message. So there's an encryption key inside my medical device, and there's one in the cloud. And the phone at that point is just passing it through. Now, it's a really good way to limit the amount of impact that a compromised smart device could have on your security. And it's aligned with best practices around, Bluetooth Low Energy and generally. And we have
So
seen a lot of our clients doing that.
I think one of the kind of mistakes that people make early on when they're first implementing Bluetooth, they think, oh, this is going to be very limited. We're only going to do one thing. We're going to get data in one direction, and there's not a whole lot of risk there. But we've seen this over and over again as throughout the industry. You start there, but you realize over time you're going to move more functionality on the smartphone or into the cloud, and you're going to have more bidirectional communication and sort of more criticality in that integration. So thinking about it not just for what you have now, but where you're likely going. And again, we see those patterns over and over again. And then you have to sort of redo it. If you use just works at the beginning and you could justify it for now, at some point it's no longer justifiable.
And Bernard, that sounds consistent with what people should be doing with all software and medical devices, is where might we grow and where do we want to leave on-ramps, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And let me deduce from this that it sounds like you're seeing an increasing level of consistent sophistication on the other side of the table when you're meeting with the regulators discussing this.
Is that for me or
Well, I'll throw that out to anybody who sat at the table or talked to people sitting at the table. It sounds like the FDA is building their capes to ask these questions.
We've definitely seen them asking a lot more questions. And especially looking for justification of the decisions that you've made. And, if you don't have a threat model, then you're not going to get FDA approval at this point. I think it's very important to be thinking about these things, not just after the fact, but during your design and architecture.
Yeah. And I guess I would add to that as well. Something that trips people up a lot, especially when they're talking about something that's communicating with something outside of the scope of their formal device, is the scope of consideration when it comes to security and threat modeling and risk management. You have to consider all of those peripheral systems that are adjacent to your system. So if that Bluetooth is talking to something, well, it would be talking to something. You have to think about the security considerations of that thing that you're talking to and how that could affect the overall security profile of your device. And a lot of folks don't include that in the scope of their pen test, in the scope of their threat model, in the scope of their risk management. They're used to kind of like keeping the scope very narrow in just their device proper. But when it comes to security, so much of the impact to your device, but also the impact of your device to other systems is related to what it's talking to and how you control that. And then also the FDA is going to want to make sure that you're talking to your customers about how you've secured Bluetooth and if there are more secure configurations. We all know that security is a shared responsibility. And if you kind of forget to tell the people who are using your device how to most securely use it and what you've done to secure it, you've dropped the ball in that shared responsibility. So that's another big piece of it as well.
Could you maybe give an example or two to elaborate on those points, Michelle?
So, I mean, I don't know if I could speak necessarily to specific Bluetooth elements, but if you have different configuration, like if things are configurable on your system and you have a most secure configuration, one, try to have your default be that most secure configuration. So if there are choices the way that you're allowing Bluetooth to communicate, one, default to the most secure way if at all possible, but also explain the risk trade-offs that you're making if you change those configurations from that default or from that most secure element. That's part of it. Buddy kind of talked about the updates as well, letting your client know or your customer know how you plan to do updates and that you will promise them updates, how you're going to communicate those to them, or another example for just generally making sure that the customer knows what their responsibilities are, how you're going to communicate with them, and how them making choices about the way they use device could impact the risks that you planned or understood for that device.
It seems like there's a couple of areas where when you start to put together consumers, bring your own device, smartphone apps that are essentially multifunction devices, but the functions, most of them are not related to medicine at all. It's, Krispy Kreme orders or or Facebook. And then you throw on sort of the heterogeneity of the incredible variety of devices and operating systems out there. And then let me add one more interesting factor, which I've learned about from you all, which is your device may not just be communicating over Bluetooth with this. There are other Bluetooth connections your smartphone may have or other traffic going on the air. How do you take all of that into account? And maybe you want to break that down a little bit. And how do you manage that? I think this, Michelle, that's some of what you're getting at, which is that your app on the consumer smartphone talking to your medical device is not the only game in town in the air, right, or on the device. So how do you plan through all that? I'll throw it to Buddy.
Yeah, one of the things that is really important to consider in a connected device, especially on the smartphone side, is your app that's running to communicate with your medical device. If it's not in the foreground, it's not necessarily a priority, and you don't have any guarantees that it's always going to be running. The other thing that is really important to consider is once my smartphone is paired with the BLE device and they're communicating securely, it's not just my application that can talk to that peripheral. Any application on that same device can talk to the peripheral. So you have to be careful to make sure that on the device side, that you're talking to your application. And on the application side, you have some controls or some protections to prevent, application that's been tampered with, or even it could even be an app that's just unintentionally communicating with your peripheral. There's a variety of approaches to that. And I think the sort of that additional encryption layer is one good way to ensure that.
Wait, so you're saying that like if you have a 12-year-old with an insulin pump and an app on their iPhone, TikTok could be talking to their insulin pump?
Theoretically, yes, but I don't think TikTok has the OS level permissions for Bluetooth Low Energy. But some other application or even, malware, if you have a compromised device, could be talking to your peripheral.
But if you have a connected tennis racket or basketball,
right,
those apps could be doing it. Interesting. Bernhard, how do you plan for that in application design?
I think some of this is there's a lot of best practices out there, and you have to see which ones make sense. So there's lots of good things out there from OWASP, from the Bluetooth SIG. These are all things that are sort of in your library of sort of approaches. But ultimately, right, this is just like patient risk management, which is an ongoing process. Cybersecurity risk management is an ongoing process that sort of you need to think about through the entire product life cycle, especially in something like this where not everything is fully in your control, right? If you are doing BYOD on the smartphone side, then you have operating system changes and potentially hardware changes, and new hardware being introduced on the smartphone side, as well as the constant addition of new features or updates that you can do on that side of things, right? That's often pretty dynamic. And so you have to integrate that, into your processes in an agile fashion, right? Yes, you do upfront. Let's look at the architecture. Let's look at our technology choices, et cetera. But as you are sort of building and moving along, you have to take patient risk management into consideration, and cybersecurity risk management as well. Have best practices, but also use the right kind of tooling. And there's lots of it out there. One of the things we like to use is a suite of tools from a company called GuardSquare. So doing static and dynamic code analysis, code obfuscation of different kinds, and kind of integrating that into the CI/CD environment, and also providing monitoring on top of that, right? So it's a comprehensive process. You want someone who has, it's not an afterthought. Just like you have a risk manager role on your teams, you have to have someone who is actually managing cybersecurity as part of it.
What about vulnerabilities that come not from your app, but underneath, either from the OS on a smartphone, or vulnerabilities from the Bluetooth stack that you're getting from whoever making your Bluetooth chip or the protocols on top of it? How do you deal with that before you deploy, and then afterwards, I guess, because that's probably, Michelle, part of the ongoing part. You get a new threat that emerges under you. How do you handle that?
Sorry, Randy, I was answering a question in here. Were you talking? Sorry, I was trying to type up a couple of more complicated answers that were more general regulatory stuff, so I was putting that in the Q&A.
Multitasking.
Are you trying to, or are you asking about vulnerabilities that sit in subcomponents of primary components? Is that what you're asking? Okay.
Yeah. So the vulnerability comes not from your code, but from the Android version or from the Bluetooth stack.
Yeah. So definitely that comes to an SBOM kind of question, right? So I've been working originally with the NTIA and their software transparency and SBOM initiatives. SBOMs have been very, very hot topics, not only for different regions, for markets, but also the overall International Medical Device Regulators Forum just released an SBOM paper. But that's why you need an SBOM, because an SBOM is not just what are the components I put in my product. They're also what are the components of the components, those subcomponent questions. So truly understanding the vulnerabilities in your system require you to know more than just I put eggs, flour, and chicken broth in my recipe. It's also what was in that chicken broth. Was it salt or no salt, right? And so that matters when it comes to vulnerabilities, because a lot of what we see, especially since this SBOM work has been very popular, a lot of what we've seen is people would not know that they were vulnerable to some of the more challenging global threats out there if they didn't know the subcomponent level of what's in their product. So this ability to manage vulnerabilities in the post-market space requires you to have deeper knowledge of your product than just what you put in it.
It's interesting,
the quality of those ingredients. Yeah.
Presumably something that, like on the pharma side of the FDA, they have a lot of experience with, which is what are all the things going into a drug, and where did they come from, and where did that come from, and where did that come from, and what was the quality all along the line, right?
Right, exactly.
Getting it to almost like a molecular level with us.
Well, and it's also, sometimes I say the analogy of, if I'm allergic to peanuts, it matters if there are nuts in that product. But it also matters if it was processed in a facility with nuts, right? So you can have impacts just because of adjacency to something, not just because you put it in there. So it's important to know those details when it comes to vulnerability analysis, and also how you've configured those products, because you could have a component in there, but you don't have certain functionality turned on. So that comes, I wouldn't speak to that from a Bluetooth perspective because I don't know that in depth enough. But any functionality you put into a product, understanding how you've enabled that third-party component to function will be an important part of whether it's vulnerable to something that's associated with it.
And I think, there are some things you can do with third-party components as well in terms of, if I'm only using certain things within that, put a wrapper around it so that, that's the only thing you can do, and you can't do do the other things within that. I mean, I think a lot of this, very often you have a lot of components, right, in your system, a lot of libraries and things like that. So doing all of this manually is and checking all these things manually is definitely a challenge. But there are a lot of tools that are out there and that are getting an ecosystem built around this that's getting more sophisticated for dealing with SBOMs, integrating that into your configuration management and having alerts and things like that around that, so that it's not so much of a manual process. You have to figure out how to, if not automate everything, automate a lot of it, because otherwise things will fall through the cracks.
And I would assume the corollary to that is you automate it, but once you find something, you want to know who owns these components, who develops them, who supports them, possibly already have a line of communication with them. So if something pops, you're not Googling going, whose DLL is this? Whose library is this?
Yeah. Well, and it does really become a push for better supplier control and picking better ingredients, right? If you're not going to be able to get patches for something that you're putting in there, and Bluetooth, from my understanding, and again, I'm not a Bluetooth expert, I'll be honest with you about that, but from what I've heard in discussions around regulatory conversations, Bluetooth is often associated with vulnerabilities. Like, anything that's used widely, it's something that they pop up a lot, right? And so the FDA has indicated in public commentary that if you put something in your device that they know is problematic in its support, that it's going to go out of support, that is already out of support, or it has a really bad track record, you're going to get a lot of questions. And trying to get that product through market is going to prove challenging. So don't try to put in a product through the FDA if you have not updated your Bluetooth software, right? Or your protocols or anything like that, because they're going to look at those things and they won't just say, oh, you have an SBOM, check, you're good. They will look at the pedigree of the things that are in your SBOM. So
could somebody give an example of a case where there's been, a random security researcher at the University of North Arizona who's all of a sudden published some known problem with Bluetooth or an implementation of Bluetooth that left people scrambling?
well, yeah, there's Buddy might have a better.
Yeah, there was a class of BLE vulnerabilities called Blue Sven, I believe, that affected a lot of devices. It was a bug in the firmware for the device stack. I don't believe it led to any patient harm, but it did lead to some scrambling to say, okay, how does this affect our device? Are we vulnerable to it? And what is the impact of that? I think it's really important. And, I generally live in the security space, but there is overlap between security and safety. So one of the things that I think is really important is if you have a BLE link, you should design your system such that if that link goes down or is disrupted, the system still functions safely. If the Bluetooth stack is completely offline because of a denial of service, then the device still has to be able to function and not cause patient harm.
Right. Well, and FDA actually released that Sventooth vulnerability as a news release on their website because so many medical devices were impacted. That was back in 2020. But I mean, if you just Google Bluetooth vulnerabilities, there's all kinds of them. And it's one of the reasons that the FDA really puts a focus on that, is because it's one of those things that you see, oops, we see a lot of vulnerabilities. Let's make sure that they're sending out the most protected version of this. And to Buddy's point earlier, do they have a plan to make sure that they keep it up to date and have a way of updating and addressing these vulnerabilities as they come out over time? Because we know there are going to be some. Right.
So actually, this might be a good case to then drill into a little bit to talk about what best practices look like. So if you're a device manufacturer, you're using a Bluetooth stack from somebody else, and all of a sudden there's a threat that's released that extends to potentially anybody. What does it look like if you're really on the ball and executing well? What do you have in place? What kicks into gear? What can you show? How long does it take?
I think a lot of that comes down to your post-market process,
Mhm.
and you have to have a process for reviewing vulnerabilities that were identified and then saying, okay, does this impact our device? Yes or no? What does that impact? And is this something that we need to respond immediately and do an out of band update? Or is this something that maybe is not an immediate concern, but we'll fix it in our next release? And relying on your vendors a lot for that as well. You know, if you have a library or a particular chipset, you know, your vendor who provides that chipset should also be working with you on that post-market plan, so that if there is an issue, you know, they're able to get you an update and they're able to help you get that update installed securely. But again, that really boils down to, you have to have patchability so that you can respond quickly. The other thing that could be done is, if there's a vulnerability in a BLE device that really you can't fix it and it's urgent, having an ability to turn that link off, having an ability to shut down that communications layer so that you're not impacted until you can implement the fix to turn it back on.
And a backup.
I think that's yeah, that's important as well, right? I think because again, this could be on a physical device side, it could be on the smartphone side as well, right? So you know, how do you prevent the use of this? Because you're not always going to be able to. You don't control, let's say, a patient's smartphone. So to some extent, you're relying on the them updating the software. In many cases, you can say you can't use it. You need a new version of the software, et cetera. So there is something you can do that, but that's only if they're connected to the internet at some point in that process. So, you know, shutting it off is you know, can be tricky in that regard. I'd say the other thing that I've seen, you know, when companies move from not connected devices to devices that are connected in this way, thinking about sort of your change management processes in general and sort of your software update processes. You know, if your processes for doing risk management and for doing software updates involve, you know, are 1 month, 2 month cycles for everything, and involve, you know, 30 people all being in a room and signing off on something, you're not equipped to handle fast cybersecurity related issues. So you need to kind of really think through and work through before it happens. You know, what are the things that we can very quickly evaluate to make a determination? Is this needed as a hot fix, and are there patient risk as well as cybersecurity issues? Because your fix could be, you know, could also be have issues in that regard. So really, you know, look at your SOPs in that regard. Think of what that needs to look like, and then, you know, pre-bake a lot of the, you know, the risk management kinds of things, right? In terms of where patient risk is within your system, and how isolated those different and protected those different parts are.
So we only have 5 minutes left for the core session before we move to answer. So when I look at what do we want to do as our last question here for anybody who has to drop off, I think that you all have raised something in different ways, which is interesting, which is there's sort of different routes to getting to Bluetooth on your device, and they each have kind of their own implications. I'm going to run through a couple, some of which you've named. So one is, it's a new device and it's sort of born Bluetooth. From day one, you've designed this device to use Bluetooth or BLE. Bernard, you mentioned you could have a device that was essentially an offline device. It was a non-connected device that now in a new version, you're going straight to BLE. Buddy, you had mentioned you could have been using some kind of a proprietary radio protocol and say, okay, you know what, we're done with that. We're going to switch from that to Bluetooth, right? We're going to jump on the bandwagon. Michelle, you had named examples where like Bluetooth is on the hardware. It's a Bluetooth, your communications chip supports Bluetooth, but you're not using it. It's just sort of sitting there turned off. And then I think the last one, which nobody mentioned, is sort of over time, Bluetooth evolves. We've gone from 4.x to 5.x. We've gone from classic to BLE. You could be on just works and then move off, which means you're sort of, jumping from one version to the next. So sounds like each of those has a slightly different set of questions you might want to be asking or potential risks that could emerge. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's really important when you think about securing a communications link to actually document the assumptions you're making about that link. And I think this is where let's just bolt Bluetooth on and we can send any command to it over Bluetooth because it's our thing. That's a very risky approach. So you have to actually think about what are the controls you can put on that link to make sure that the actions that are being requested are safe and are authenticated and authorized. So it's really the same things that you would think about for any kind of connectivity. We think about authentication, authorization, confidentiality, integrity, availability, all these classic security concerns. They apply over BLE just as much as they do over any other communications link.
And if I could just add to that, also making sure that if you're getting your product pen tested, that you make sure that that is in scope of the test as well. Because, sometimes pen tests are a little bit more surface-like and they tend to do scans, but a true pen test should be a manual assessment of how can I break into this device. And Bluetooth is like, I don't want to speak for Buddy, but like to me, that's like a big bullseye. Like, okay, we're going to go take a look at that, and making sure that you allow your pen testers to do that. And if you're going through a third party, when you're scoping this, that firm should be expected to do that and put that in scope, right? And scoping those kinds of pen tests with these types of communication aspects and making sure you clearly understand what they're going to test and how they're going to test it, because the FDA is very, very interested in the scope of what you've instructed that firm to do. And if you put any constraints on their ability to test and get creative and how they can break into your system, and ensure that it's tested fully. So part of this is design, but also it's taking a third party that doesn't understand your design and seeing if they can break it. That's why pen testing is really important as early as you can feasibly do it, at least to get a first round, because you do not want to pen. I mean, anyone who's listened to me, I always seem to get here, Buddy, don't I? Like, please do not ask for a pen test 2 months before you submit, right? A pen test should be especially if it's the only one or the first one you've gotten. A pen test should inform your design. It is just as much a test of a final product as it is a test of the design and whether you need to feed back. I've never seen, at least on our end, a clean pen test. And I've actually asked the FDA this as well, just kind of in passing during courses that I teach with them publicly. And have you ever seen a clean pen test? And the answer is like, well, if it's kind of more of a scan, wasn't really assessed. Sometimes they can see something if it was configured a certain way, but there really isn't a clean pen test. So if it's clean, I would question it.
And there was a question in the Q&A of, does the FDA require a penetration test report? And the answer is absolutely yes.
Yeah.
And on that point, one thing that I think is worth mentioning is, if I have a device and I have an application and I have a cloud service and a web portal, they want that test to include all of these things. I shouldn't be doing a test of the device and then a test of just the application without the device and a test of just the cloud environment, because that's like crash testing a side view mirror of your car. You really need to see how all of these pieces interact to form the whole system, and your test should demonstrate that.
Yeah. And
So
just to add on to that, it should be a full pen test report, and you should speak to what you did with the results. Tacking on a pen test report and just saying, here's some information for you, is going to be a very, that it's like, ding, ding, there's a deficiency, because they're going to ask what you did with the findings.
Yeah.
So that's an important part too.
It's part of your risk management process, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think sort of not a, tie a bow on it. It to some extent, if you think about it, when you're doing, let's say, verification and validation, right? At some point, you're going to do formal verification, formal validation, but that does not start then. If you wait to do any verification and validation activities until you do a formal run for the record, you're really not doing your job. This is stuff that happens throughout the course of it. As you build out functionality, you are verifying and informally testing all of these things so that you don't end up with surprises at the end. It's very analogous in this regard. The one thing that, in our development work, we always emphasize and try to align with the different stakeholders in this, is that integration between the different subsystems is super critical. And if you leave that integration for late, then it is very difficult to manage that well. It has all kinds of implications. So we suggest, as much as possible, is to build out from those integrations. Start with the integrations more so than the functionality that is inside of the other things, because that then, if you build out from that, you can start doing testing around these things, and you can test those integrations. That is where a lot of kind of the how long it takes to actually develop and integrate, where a lot of the big program and project risks are, by deferring those until later, and it cascades into doing the pen testing later. If you don't have any integrations, you don't have any protocols early on, well, you can't do any pen testing in the first place, right?
And there's a basic question towards the end of the Q&A right now. I just wanted to clarify. So Orthogonal doesn't do pen testing, MedSec does pen testing. But and I think a little bit of this is a little bit of tongue in cheek from Bruce, but I will say that we get brought in for design support as well as pen testing. And so if we are brought in for design feedback during a development project, that same person that was helping that client would not be put on their pen test. So internally, we would not put the same person. They wouldn't help inform the design and then test the design. So you can use a company as long as they have a deep enough bench to segregate those folks. I would recommend that you tell the company that you want them to do that, because not every technical services organization, especially if they're not specific to medical device, will understand that need for independence of test. So I don't want to belabor that. I just wanted to clarify, like, you can use the same company for pen testing and design. They just have to be individuals within the company that are separate, and it's clear about who did what on the project.
And the way Orthogonal does it is we do not have that Chinese wall, and we rely on a third party for that pen testing. Close close collaboration with MedSec. We do the same kind of thing if you're thinking about human factors testing, right? We will do formative human factors work, but we will rely on a third party to do summative human factors. It's just, it's cleaner, frankly, to do that. And sometimes, trying to manage that internally is not isn't so easy. So
Michelle, I'd like to say this next question is from the audience, but it's actually mine. Does that lead to some really interesting trash talking at holiday parties between people on two sides of the same project?
We would never talk about a project outside the project. We do have fun virtual holiday parties. We're all over the world. So, we have had holiday parties virtually, which is kind of funny, but we just play bingo. We don't trash talk.
No trash talk. Okay. A question that's not quite on point for this webinar, but we have a nice selection of people here to answer it, which is somebody basically saying, hey, how much Bluetooth changed before you have to refile a new 510K submission? Like when you do upgrades or security challenges, like how do you figure that into your sort of your regulatory strategy?
Well, there's a guidance about with a flow chart that determines modifications to software that would result in a change to a medical device, or modifications to software that would result in a new submission. Basically, we call it the 510K modifications guidance for software. There's one for general changes as well. There's a software specific one. When I was co-chair of AdvaMed, we actually ghost wrote that for the FDA, so I'm pretty familiar with it. But basically, you're going to trigger a new 510K if you have created changes to the product. They're going to create new questions or significant change to safety and or effectiveness. And so changing things about your Bluetooth could trigger a 510K if you change what it talks to, how open it is, what you use it for, right? If you used to use it just for pushing information out of the system, and now you want to use it to receive software updates to the system, that would definitely change the risk profile. So there is a flow chart in the software modifications guidance from FDA where you can kind of figure out where they are. But basically, if your change is creating new risk line items in your risk management, you have to create new controls, you're probably falling into a new submission at that point.
But one thing, and Michelle, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is if there's an update that's just to address a vulnerability, you do not have to do a new filing for that. So if we're going from our Bluetooth firmware 1.1 to 1.2 because there's a BlueSpin vulnerability and that's the only change, then that does not require new filing. Is that correct?
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, buddy. That's actually a really good point to discuss. There's a lot of special rules. The FDA really wants to stay out of the way for you applying patches to your devices. And so if you have a basic patch delivered by the vendor, putting that out there usually does not even fall into the realm of a recall. Typically, they're considered what are called enhancements by the FDA, and you can just push those patches out. Now, if you're having to do a whole operating system version update because of something, and it's a significant thing, you may have to consider it. But it is a very rare case where patching for a software vulnerability would result in even a recall type situation. There's a lot of details about that, both in the FDA's post-market guidance for cyber, as well as the recalls versus enhancement guidance out of FDA.
Is that something you can address proactively in the initial submission of kind of setting parameters for what you're allowed to do and in what context, almost sort of a non-AI version of PCCP?
Well, the FDA has outlined it pretty well. So my recommendation is to outline it in your quality system. So if somebody questions it, you say you're following your quality system. Then if an auditor or a regulator decides they want to challenge your quality system, they can do that. But the biggest thing is making sure that you have it clear what you're deciding before you have to make the decision. So it's more important that your quality system gives good detailed guidance about where you're going to go and what you're going to do in a given scenario.
We've had a couple questions about sort of consumer bring your own device, of whether consumers can be doing things ongoing that can disrupt the Bluetooth. Can they go and change configurations or other things? Can they drop the phone?
So there's two approaches to that. We have seen some of our customers that they send out a tablet with BLE medical devices that are already paired up and communicating, and those tablets are really locked down and controlled so that you can't, say, install TikTok on them. And that approach is really good if the risk analysis and acceptability says, you know what, we cannot risk a malicious app being on this device. We can't risk someone with a 15-year-old Android phone trying to connect to this thing. But it's a more complex approach because now you also have to manage the operating system updates and the firmware. And when you have to replace these devices, it creates a lot more challenges. But if you allow customers to install the apps on their own devices, then you have to have that same risk analysis and trade-offs and be able to justify that decision. Michelle, do you have anything you'd like to speak to on that? Of an app running on a consumer's phone versus one that the MDM provides?
I'd say that the guidance on mobile medical apps applies, and if you're using the platform to enable intended use of the app, then the platform gets involved. But overall, I don't think that there is really a huge distinction of whether you're using a dedicated platform or an open platform. It all depends on how you manage the access to it, I guess. Did I answer your question right? I'm not sure if I am.
I think so.
Yeah, I would say, you have to sort of, again, realize that in under those circumstances, there are other apps, there are other things that are happening, and you have to understand what those potential threats are and how you mitigate against those, right? So, not making it easy for some third-party app to just, whether that's malware or otherwise, to connect into your Bluetooth device. That should be a matter, of course, of what you're doing. Whether you're in an MDM situation or it's a BYOD situation where you don't control what other apps are on there, right? As far as what users can do, what someone's using a smartphone can do, there's certain things where you from the app cannot control sort of certain settings and configurations for Bluetooth, and you have to sort of walk the user through, this is how you set up this, or this is how you give permission to this app to do this type of thing. So there's very often manual things that an end user needs to do, and sometimes they do that and sometimes they undo that. If they undo those things, then typically that means your app isn't going to function, and you need to provide alerts and other types of things. Say, hey, we notice this is not enabled, you have to enable this, etc. But they typically can't do something that opens it up, right? The operating system providers on the smartphones are not interested in creating additional vulnerabilities for obvious reasons.
So it's somewhere between the two mantras of only the paranoid survive, and just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you.
Yeah, and I get one little thing to add there, though, is it also depends on what you're using. Like most medical device manufacturers, for example, will launch on iOS because it's more controlled than Android, right? And so you also have to consider how well controlled what's allowed on a platform and operating system, and Apple certainly does. And Apple certainly does a better job with that because that's their intention. The Android platforms are intended to be more open, but that also makes them more dangerous for safety critical type applications. So
again, yeah, on Android, you're not sort of what you're doing is not. It's Android, and they're all the same, right? Really, it's the individual smartphone vendors implementation of Android, right? So your mileage may vary. I trust Google pretty well, and I trust Samsung pretty well. But there are, how well do I trust, Xiaomi or someone like that? Maybe not so much, or some very small one in some that I really have very little knowledge and understanding of. So thinking about not just for cybersecurity, but in general, strategically about what your allow list, block list looks like, and how you kind of both validate safety and functionality when you have potentially new smartphones and smartphone operating system combinations is something you have to really think through, and think through the different layers of how you might validate and protect is important.
So I think we've covered a pretty broad spectrum of the questions we've been asked and sort of from our conversation. So let me close with a slightly different question. There's a lot to this. Anybody listening who's brand new to Bluetooth and is getting ready to put in a device should rightfully be a little on edge at how much domain knowledge there is for this. So this is kind of knowing that this is a biased question you're asking to consultants. When do you need to hire internal people who have been there and done that with this before in different domains, cybersecurity, software engineering, regulatory quality? When is it enough to kind of just leverage a consultant to help you get smart? How do you transition that if this is a new domain for you?
well, I think that having an initial conversation with someone that you trust who understands that space, and they come prepared to ask some probing questions about how ready you are, you can usually get a good feel for that. A lot of times we'll do just basic triage of people's documents to give them a feel for, how close are you to the endpoint? I don't know if other groups do that, but it really, really depends on not only what you've prepared, what you plan to prepare, but it also really depends on the risk profile of your device. I hate to do the it depends, but if you're talking about something that's going to be life-sustaining, implantable, something risk critical, I would say find someone as soon as possible, because making bad design choices early can be very, very costly to fix later. For things that are less risky, there you have other options, right? You have a variety of options. Also, how complex the system is. I'd say that the challenge of your system that's connected to the Bluetooth should relate to how soon you bring someone in, and whether you need to or not, is because all of this is risk-based, in my opinion, so.
But it sounds like the absolute is you should get somebody in as soon as possible to do an initial evaluation, just to say, is your risk-based spread box estimation right or not?
Yeah.
I mean, I would say this: if you are developing medical device software, connected device systems, right? It needs to be integral to how you do this, right? You have to do patient risk management, and you have to do cybersecurity risk management, and you have to be competent about it. Now, you can say leverage someone like Orthogonal to do that design and development under their quality management system, but then at some point, operationally, the buck stops with you afterwards for monitoring, et cetera. You can rely on a partner to do some of that, and then and then realize that no one has all of the knowledge. That's why we work with someone like MedSec, because we see a lot of things, but they're really specialized in this as well. So it depends on, where is the work getting done and what is your role within this. But you can't sort of say, oh, let's get a little cybersecurity here at the beginning. Let's get some cybersecurity at the end, and now we're done. That is not how it works, right?
Yeah. Well, and another like kind of maybe a cheat sheet kind of thing. If you go into the answered tab in the Q&A and scroll all the way to the bottom, I did put a NIST publication list there, which is their general guide to Bluetooth security. If you start going over that and it seems like a foreign language, that's probably a good test of whether, or you have your technical people, like, can you speak to this? Do you have answers to this? Is this on your plan? NIST has a lot of really, really great free resources. Our taxpayer dollars pay for them. And so looking at NIST for technical resources to understand things like Bluetooth, and this isn't BLE, it's general Bluetooth, but they do mention BLE in just even the abstract. So looking at some of these documents, and if a lot of stuff seems confusing, that's a good time to bring in someone, and maybe they'll look at your particular product and say, it's not a huge lift. And others, you want to be really careful with how you design this. And this is where our friends from Orthogonal can be really helpful in thoughtfully designing these types of products. And we're always happy to weigh in on that from a security perspective. So
Right. Well, I think that brings us to a pretty good conclusion here. I think we've addressed just about all the questions that we can. If we didn't, feel free to catch us offline. Also, we will be sharing this again as a video and as a summary blog. If you want to do us a solid, anybody you think might value this content or any future content that we're putting out or webinars, by all means, please pass this on. You'll get a gold star. And that's it. You're welcome to reach out to any of us. We appreciate you taking your time today for this. And thanks to all of our panelists today.
And thanks you for
everyone.
your great job being a excellent host, Randy, as always.
And happy 4th of July for those of you in the United States.
Thanks so much.
Right.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.